And yeah, Steve, you always talk about Anavar like it's the best thing ever. But be honest with us, bro. Is Anavar really worth it? Is it worth sourcing the entire internet for finding legitimate Anavar? Vigorous Steve here. On today's episode of Worth It or Not, we're going to discuss 4 oral esterless dehydrotestosterone derivatives. 3 of them are 17-alpha alkylated, reducing metabolism in the liver on the first pass. And between you and me, you can actually reduce this metabolism and increase the bioavailability of 17-alpha alkylated oral anabolic androgenic steroids with grapefruit juice. Don't tell anybody, that's our secret. And the 4th compound which we're going to discuss isn't 17-alpha alkylated and a very good substrate for the 3-hydroxy steroid dehydrogenase enzymes, which are found in skeletal muscle, which further reduces its anabolic potential and its overall bioavailability. We're going to start off this video series, which oral anabolic androgenic steroids are worth it or not, with the most cookie cutter steroids anybody could source anywhere that are very commonly used, that everybody's familiar with. Mesterolone, brand name Proviron, Chlorodehydrotestosterone, abbreviated to CDMT, brand name Turinabol, the only steroid which was designed for athletes, albeit that many of these athletes were administered with Turinabol without their knowledge. So there was a little bit of a hush-hush doping protocol as part of East Germany. We're going to discuss Oxandrolone, brand name Anavar, which is hands down, no contest, no ifs or buts about it, the best oral steroid out there that can be taken for longer periods of time, whether you're a woman or a man, higher dosages, lower dosages, any kind of cycle design. Oxandrolone has its place. Right? I'm a huge fan of Oxandrolone. And we're also going to discuss Stenazolol, brand name Winstrol. Before we get into all of that, please like the video, leave a comment for the algorithm, and consider subscribing if you haven't already. And please do me a solid, hit the notification bell button so you can get notified whenever a new Worth It or Not video drops. Let's start with Mesterolone, Proviron. Is Proviron worth taking or not? In which context does Proviron offer some benefits? Again, I already mentioned that Proviron is readily metabolized by the 3-alpha hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase enzymes. That means it has very low anabolic properties, and you would need to dose this compound relatively high. Now, if you're going to dose compounds relatively high, there's much more suitable compounds out there that will potentiate anabolism even at lower and much more effective dosages. So what can we use Proviron for? Well, contextually speaking, there's only one reason to use Proviron. Because it has such a high affinity for the sex hormone-binding globulin, Proviron can be used to lower sex hormone-binding globulin concentrations in the bloodstream and increase free testosterone concentrations. Fingers crossed, the main reason why people use Proviron is to enhance their libido. Now, Proviron has been prescribed in cases of androgen deficiency. I don't think that's a suitable replacement for testosterone. So if you're suffering from androgen deficiency, test is fucking best. But if you're using a TRT dose, a true TRT dose, where serum testosterone levels are middle top of the reference range, let's be a little bit more generous. Let's say 700 nanograms per deciliter, upwards of 1200 nanograms per deciliter. And in this context, with biweekly administrations, you see that your sex hormone-binding globulin levels are still not optimal. You would like to have them around 20, 25, 30 nanomoles per liter. But in this case, your SHBG levels are 40, 50, maybe still 60 nanomoles per liter. In this context, you can use a low-dose Proviron, 12.5 milligrams in the morning and in the evening, to reduce your SHBG levels and free more testosterone. Now, there's an issue here, because there's a sex hormone-binding globulin receptor complex, which potentiates anabolism through a different pathway besides the androgen receptor. When testosterone binds to SHBG and attaches to the receptor complex on the cell membrane, it increases cyclic adenosine monophosphate concentrations within skeletal muscle, which further activates the androgen receptor and acts as a cofactor for androgen-mediated gene transcription. Now, if there's Proviron in the sex hormone-binding globulin and the testosterone is floating around, you probably miss out on the cyclic adenosine monophosphate. So the testosterone that you're taking might actually be less anabolic. You're taking the place of testosterone in the SHBG with Proviron. Now, Proviron will lower SHBG concentrations over time, freeing up more testosterone. So maybe initially you notice that your libido will go up, but over time, as you keep taking Proviron, especially at higher dosages, the SHBG declines further and further and further. Now, the cyclic adenosine monophosphate concentrations within skeletal muscle and perhaps other tissues in the body is rapidly declining, not activating and acting as a cofactor for androgen-mediated gene transcription. And now you're losing out on anabolism. Now you're losing out on libido and well-being. And this is a common side effect of people that megadose or overdo their Proviron or crush their SHBG levels too much, thinking that it's going to improve their libido, but in reality, it actually made it worse. You have to respect Proviron for what it is. It has one sole purpose, to reduce SHBG. And if you're on TRT and you're doing daily macro administrations, let's say 15 milligrams test enantate, cypionate, propionate, whatever ester you prefer, that will already reduce SHBG levels because daily micro administrations reduces the conversion of testosterone into estradiol, and estradiol regulates SHBG production in the liver. So a steady influx of androgens and a reduced aromatization potential through daily micro administrations, you'll see that SHBG levels, generally speaking, are already optimal. And in this case, there's absolutely no need to add Proviron to your TRT protocol to reduce SHBG further. Proviron has a relative binding affinity for the sex hormone-binding globulin compared to dehydrotestosterone at 80% up to 440%. There's a range here because there's only been 2 surveys where they determined the relative binding affinity of Proviron compared to DHT, which has a relative binding affinity of 100. That's the gold standard for binding affinity to the SHBG. And when you compare that to Winstrol, it has a relative binding affinity of 1 to 36% compared to DHT. If you take Winstrol 10 milligrams or Proviron 25 milligrams, from all the blood work that I've seen, you see a comparable reduction in SHBG. Again, you see a worse reduction in HDL levels with Winstrol, but you also see more anabolism as a result of that, right? Because Winstrol has anabolic potential and Proviron does not. So there's only one context where you want to use Proviron, and that's solely to reduce your SHBG. And I also know what you guys are going to say, but Steve, Proviron also acts as a reversely binding aromatase inhibitor, reducing the conversion of testosterone into estradiol, keeping serum estradiol concentrations in range. And yes, this will also reduce SHBG levels further, so now you get even less anabolism out of it. So yes, you can use Proviron during TRT for that purpose, reduce SHBG, freeing your testosterone levels a little bit more, increasing your libido, reducing the conversion of testosterone into estradiol. Again, don't overdo it because you need testosterone and estradiol and SHBG for flawless libido. And besides that, there's no real application of using Proviron on cycle. You can use Primobolan or boldenone or dihydroboldenone or Mesterolone to reduce the conversion of testosterone into estradiol, because those compounds are also known to reversely bind to the aromatase enzyme and prevent the conversion of testosterone into estradiol. But these compounds don't pass the liver, don't potentiate any liver toxicity, don't get metabolized in the liver on the first pass because you're taking them as an injectable. They're esterified, resulting in more stable serum concentrations, and they're actually anabolic. Choose those compounds over Proviron if you're actually doing a cycle and looking for anabolism. Last thing you might be able to consider if you're drug-free. I've had consultations with people who absolutely do not want to take injectables. Their serum SHBG levels are very, very high for whatever reason. In that context, a puny dose of 6.25 milligrams Proviron once or twice per day, spaced over 2 administrations, morning and evening, or only 6.5 milligrams Proviron in the morning, is more than enough to reduce SHBG levels to more favorable ranges, increasing libido by freeing up the little amount of endogenous testosterone that they're producing, no longer being stuck in the SHBG, but still weakly bound to albumin, of course. So in this context, they might be able to improve libido and increase their state of well-being because of it. But 6.25 milligrams Proviron or even 12.5 milligrams Proviron per day seems to be not enough to downregulate the HPTA. So there might be something to say for using Proviron when you're otherwise drug-free. Again, you don't qualify as calling yourself drug-free because Proviron, after all, is an anabolic androgenic steroid, albeit very, very low in androgenicity and very, very low in anabolism. It's still classified as one, so you're no longer natty. But if you don't care about that, a low dose of Proviron might be the tipping point between having decent libido and pretty goddamn good libido, right? So this is the only two places where I feel that Proviron has its place. I know there are coaches out there that really megadose the Proviron, 100 milligrams per day, 200, 300 milligrams oral Proviron per day, and they seem to get good results with it. I've never recommended that much Proviron or recommended any Proviron during a contest prep. I've always gotten pretty good results with the other oral steroids, which we're going to discuss in this Worth It or Not video series. So I'm probably the wrong guy to ask for Proviron during contest prep, but I know there are fans of Proviron during contest prep, and there seem to be quite a few of them, so there must be something to say for it. Let's move over to Turinabol, Chlorodehydrotestosterone, the only steroid designed for athletes. When is it worth it? Well, I think it's worth it on your first cycle. So let's say you start with your first cycle. I've discussed this a couple times before. You're going with an oral that doesn't aromatize, unlike Dianabol, for example, that is always a very popular kickstart, which, well, that's the cycle of yesteryear. I don't advise anybody to do a Dianabol kickstart. Already made videos about that. I'll link it at the end of this one. So instead of using Dianabol on your first cycle, ruining your aromatization potential and, of course, resulting in a lot of acne, water retention, moon face, and, well, luckily, Dianabol comes with skin-splitting pump, so at least that's cool. But I feel that Turinabol is a suitable replacement. Now, I don't know anybody that uses Turinabol later on in their performance-enhancing drug journey. But in the beginning, when you're just getting your hands dirty with anabolic androgenic steroids, you have your testosterone base, you got some experience with that, and then you want to add Turinabol on top for, let's say, 8 weeks, 12 weeks in duration at a low dose of maybe 25 milligrams, and then titrate upwards to get more results out of it. I don't see anything wrong with that. And Turinabol doesn't metabolize into estradiol, unlike Dianabol, which metabolizes into metabolism resistant methyl estradiol. So it's a little bit more cumbersome to manage. And you do need to increase your aromatase inhibitors or other dihydrotestosterone derivatives to control how Dianabol converts. It isn't the case with Turinabol, so it's reasonably safe and not too cumbersome to add on top of your first cycle. As long as you do your blood work on testosterone only, you figure out how you need to control your serum estradiol concentrations, you can add Turinabol on top. Now it's chlorinated. This is one of the few compounds which is chlorinated at the 4th position, meaning that it has little to zero androgenic properties. Again, the androgenic to anabolic rating of Turinabol has been determined on paper. It has an androgenic rating of 0 and an anabolic rating of 100. Again, most of the anabolic to androgenic ratings have been determined on rodents in faulty studies, which I still need to make a video about. So maybe at one point I'll make a video debunking the anabolic to androgenic ratings. For now, all you need to know is that it potentiates very little androgenicity, only anabolism, which from anecdotal evidence and what I've seen with first-time cyclers turns out to be quite true. And generally speaking, you don't really see any signs of virilization when men use Turinabol, but when women use Turinabol, there are certainly signs of virilization. So even though on paper the androgenic rating of Turinabol is 0, in practical application, Turinabol can certainly cause virilization. So you would see maybe hair growth in places that you do not expect, or changing of the voice and deepening of the voice, or maybe a little bit of hair loss. Right? Turinabol is certainly not hair safe, even though it's touted to be hair safe. I don't believe that's the case at all. Still, out of all the oral anabolic androgenic steroids you can choose from, if you're doing a first cycle, Turinabol is probably the best oral you can choose to get your hands dirty. And Turinabol has a reasonably long half-life of up to 16 hours, making dosing quite easy. You could choose to take the entire dose of Turinabol pre-workout, put that sublingually to increase the absorption, increase the bioavailability by preventing the first pass through the liver, which lowers its bioavailability. Then swallow the remainder with grapefruit juice, so you get the most bang for your buck on this reasonably benign anabolic androgenic steroid, which you can take orally, but preferably sublingually. Now, how does it compare to Oxandrolone Anavar? Well, we already know the answer, so I'm not going to bore you with it. What I will link at the end of this video is my comparison video comparing Turinabol to Anavar, which cases they can be used, and how they compare between each other. Long story short, Anavar wins, of course. And yeah, Steve, you always talk about Anavar like it's the best thing ever. But be honest with us, bro. Is Anavar really worth it? Is it worth sourcing the entire internet for finding legitimate Anavar that's accurately dosed, containing actually Anavar, not something else, or buying pharmaceutical grade Anavar that seems to be 5 times the price of underground lab Anavar and dosed at freaking 2.5 milligrams per tablet? Steve, is it all worth it? Well, look at it this way. In most of the situations where you find yourself taking anabolic androgenic steroids, whether that's orally or injectable, Anavar always has its place, it seems, or at least in my book. If Anavar was a person, she would be an Amazonian goddess, or She-Hulk, or Wonder Woman. I mean, man, Anavar is the shit. I would love to run Anavar year-round, and well, I've actually have done that in the past at a low dose of 2.5 or 5 milligrams Anavar per day. Many guys would say, that's crazy. Why would you run 5 milligrams Anavar per day? Well, it's the best compound out there that you can take orally, and a low dose of 2.5 milligrams, 5 milligrams, maybe upwards of 10 milligrams per day for months in duration is where Anavar truly shines. One of the reasons is that Anavar contains an oxygen atom at the C2 position, making it resistant to metabolism by the 3-alpha hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase enzymes which are found in skeletal muscle. So unlike Proviron, which is readily metabolized and inactivated, Oxandrolone Anavar is metabolism resistant, just like methyl estradiol is metabolism resistant. Now, Oxandrolone will continue to potentiate its anabolic properties. It passes through the liver if you take it orally on the first pass, and then ends up in skeletal muscle, becoming metabolism resistant and potentiating more of an effect compared to other steroids which don't contain this oxygen atom that Anavar has. Anavar is probably the only sustainable anabolic steroid which you can take orally, but ideally sublingually, and wash down with grapefruit juice to increase its bioavailability further, increasing its potential for anabolism. Anavar will keep transcribing DNA, increasing its overall potential for anabolism, and a low and effective dose doesn't seem to potentiate any negative effects on your liver and marginal effects on your lipid panel. That's why I think Anavar is best. So in which context and dosing protocol can we use Anavar? If you can limit the dose to 2.5 milligrams or 5 milligrams Anavar per day, I feel it's pretty safe to run year-round. I know several women who've run 2.5 milligrams Anavar year-round and got zero virilization. If anything, they only ended up muscular, a little bit more horny, so that's an added benefit if you're in a relationship with a girl running Anavar. Don't put the girl on Anavar to make her horny, but if she decides by herself to run a low-dose Anavar year-round to look a little bit more fit and get all of the benefits associated with Anavar, well, I hope your sex drive is up to par. And for men, whether you're on TRT or doing a full-blown cycle and everything in between, 2.5 to 5 milligrams Anavar year-round goes a very, 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 very long way. Now, once you start escalating the dose upwards to 20 milligrams per day, 50 milligrams per day, I don't see how anybody can tolerate 50 milligrams pharmaceutical, legitimate, 100% purity Anavar per day. I don't see how anybody could tolerate it. So if you're dosing your Anavar at 50 milligrams per day or 100 milligrams per day, it's probably Turinabol, baby. Or it's severely underdosed. I cannot tolerate anything upwards of 25 milligrams Anavar per day. And this is coming from a guy that ran 2 grams of testosterone enanthate per week. And besides all of that, there's a ton of scientific evidence covering various treatments involving Oxandrolone in a multitude of different clinical settings. And there's a lot of literature about Oxandrolone in animal models, or how Oxandrolone acts in vivo as well as in vitro. There's a lot of research you can do on this particular compound, and many of these studies that you'll read about Oxandrolone show that it's highly promising in a multitude of different settings, and it's very beneficial for collagen synthesis, wound repair, and Oxandrolone might act as a partial antagonist for the glucocorticoid receptors, inhibiting some of the negative effects that corticosteroids have on skeletal muscle or other parts of the body, most notably the connective tissue. We all know that corticosteroids can reduce inflammation, but they also inhibit and reduce healing and collagen synthesis. Now, a compound like oxandrolone or stanozolol or trenbolone or halotestin for that matter, they're all known to inhibit these effects of corticosteroids. And halotestin might be the most potent in this regard, not only blocking the glucocorticoid receptors, but also inhibiting the enzymes which were responsible for the metabolism of cortisol into cortisone, which is biologically inactive. Now, these enzymes are the 11-beta-hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase enzymes, not to be mistaken with the 3-alpha-hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase enzymes, which are found in skeletal muscle, which inactivate steroid hormones. And the 11-beta-HSD enzymes are responsible for the breakdown of cortisol. So halotestin uniquely, and we're probably better off discussing this in the halotestin worth it or not video. Quick tangent here. With halotestin, you see that serum cortisol levels actually go quite high because cortisol has nowhere to bind to and nowhere to metabolize into. Right? So this is a unique characteristic of halotestin, and the only real negative effects that you feel from this super physiological amount of cortisol is a very high blood pressure and increased aggression. So now you're stimulating aggression through the cortisol pathway in the brain, as well as the androgen pathway in the brain in the form of halotestin. All right, back to oxandrolone. So this is a unique characteristic of oxandrolone that overlaps into trenbolone, winstrol, and halotestin, but those three aren't very sustainable. Trenbolone exposure, 6 to 8 weeks. Winstrol exposure, maybe 8 to 12 weeks if it's injectable, and I would limit oral winstrol exposure to maybe 8 weeks in duration because, again, it passes through the liver. We'll discuss that next after we're done with oxandrolone. And halotestin, well, that's a love-hate relationship of 2 weeks, and you'll love the way you look and how strong you get on halotestin, but you'll hate the way you feel. You'll hate yourself for hating everything else. So again, oxandrolone is the only sustainable compound that potentiates some anti-corticosteroid effects. It's still being prescribed quite readily for burn victims or to potentiate collagen synthesis in cases of muscle wasting diseases and cachexia, up to dosages of 20 milligrams per day. Now, when you look at all of the prescription literature, besides testosterone and oxymetalone, oxandrolone probably has one of the highest prescription dosages of 140 milligrams per week. And that's esterless, so that's pure oxandrolone at 140 milligrams per week. Now, prescription of testosterone enanthate or cypionate would range anywhere between 100 milligrams to 150 milligrams. And of course, a generous TRT clinic is going to bump up the dose to 200, 250, 300 milligrams per week. But the legitimate TRT dosages are 100 to 150 milligrams per week. That's including the ester, making the dose of testosterone on prescription lower than the dose of oxandrolone on prescription. And with oxymetalone, the dosages are way higher. They're based on body weight. The effective dosages range between 1 to 2 milligrams per 1 kilo of body weight. So that means I could run at 100 kilos, give or take, 100 milligrams of oxymetalone up to 200 milligrams oxymetalone. But there are extreme cases for body weight gain where 5 milligrams per 1 kilo of body weight are prescribed. So if I wanted to gain any more size, that will be 500 milligrams oxymetalone per day. Man, I can't wait to run 500 milligrams Anadrol per day. My liver is failing just thinking about it. I think that covers pretty much everything I wanted to discuss about oxandrolone. I think it's highly worth it in a multitude of different contexts, whether that's during the off season, during a cutting phase, a contest prep. If you're a woman, again, you have to respect the dosages because oxandrolone is somewhat metabolism resistant. So you get more bang for your buck for each milligram of oxandrolone that you take. And as you escalate the dosages upwards, of course, the exposure duration is going to be limited. I don't think anywhere upwards of 25 milligrams oxandrolone per day is warranted unless your oxandrolone is underdosed or Turinabol. So please do your due diligence researching. Make sure you get your oxandrolone from a reliable source or ideally pharmaceutical grade. And I believe there's only 2 pharmaceutical grade oxandrolones left unless you get it from a compounding pharmacy in the United States. Do your due diligence sourcing. And if you do get legitimate oxandrolone, man, it seems to be the best oral steroid you can run for a longer period of time. That being said, let's move over to stanozolol, winstrol, before this video gets way too long. When is winstrol worth it? in my opinion, and everybody seems to agree, Winstrol tablets, just like injectable Winstrol suspension, is only worth it during a cutting phase. When you're trying to get lean and your single-digit body fat levels already, let's say 8% body fat or maybe 9%, or you're bordering on 10% body fat, in that case, Winstrol can be introduced maybe 8 weeks up to 12 weeks, depending on the administration route and the dosing protocol, leading into your photo shoots or stepping on stage. Now, I will say this. It seems that Asians and Arabs respond better to Winstrol, oral Winstrol that is, than Caucasians and people of African descent. And that's purely by anecdotal observation, coaching a decent amount of competitors from all kinds of different nationalities and races. Oral Winstrol tablets do very, very well from the competitor's perspective in this part of the world. And if you're a little bit more towards Europe and America, whether that's North or South America, injectable Winstrol seems to get the job done a lot better. Now, of course, with injectable Winstrol, you really have to suffer through the post-injection pain, already making it not worth it. But if you're one of those genetic people that seem to respond very, very well to oral Winstrol, you go with that, because then you don't have to suffer from the terrible post-injection pain. All you have to worry about is liver health. And even though Winstrol is 17-alpha alkylated, whether that's injectable or the oral version, it still prevents breakdown when it passes through the liver. Now, with the injectable version, it's only going to pass the liver once, right? Because it's going through the injectable route, increasing its bioavailability further until it's deactivated by the 3-alpha hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase enzymes. And of course, when you take it orally, it passes through the liver twice, once on the way into the bloodstream and then another pass before it ends up in skeletal muscle. So if you do respond well to oral Winstrol, stay tuned. Otherwise, I would rather go with injectable Winstrol suspension instead, even though it's highly painful, unless you really dilute it with some sort of dilutant in the form of B12 carnitine, injectable glutathione, or good old sterile water. The major downside in both contexts is that Winstrol, even though it increases collagen synthesis probably greater than Oxandrolone, it doesn't improve the filaments which keep collagen together. So you see this negative effect in the connective tissue predominantly, where there's a multitude of different collagen types holding everything together. Winstrol will make the tendons thicker, but because the filaments between the collagen types and the whole structure isn't optimal, the tendons break easier. And of course, before the tendons break, you already notice that the tendons start to hurt. You get this drying out feeling. There might be an effect of Winstrol, even though I can't find any scientific evidence to support this, that Winstrol also inhibits estrogen-mediated collagen synthesis to a similar extent that Mesterolone might inhibit estrogen-mediated DNA transcription. Again, I can't find any scientific evidence, but I do notice that whether your serum estradiol levels are sky high or bottomed out, this negative effect that Winstrol has on the connective tissue, this super dry and squeaky feeling that you get in your knees and elbows every time you put them under load and stress training for hypertrophy, this happens regardless of how high your serum estradiol levels get. So I feel that there's some inhibitory action of Winstrol regarding estrogen-mediated collagen synthesis in these areas, and it also seems to happen in the skin, because Winstrol, like no other, making it highly worth it, whether it's injectable or oral, if you respond well to it. Thinning the skin with Winstrol is a real thing. Now, a lot of people would assume that Winstrol, because this is a great cutting drug, and it sure is, but Winstrol itself doesn't result in fat loss. Instead, it seems to change the collagen ratio within the skin and the subcutaneous space, allowing the skin to retract. And again, people from Asian or Arabic or Persian or Indian descent, people coming from this part of the world, they seem to respond quite favorably to Winstrol regarding its skin thinning effects, allowing these people to get away with a much lower dose compared to the Caucasians or people of African descent. So you see that commonly used dosages here in Thailand range from 30 to 50 milligrams oral Winstrol per day, and whereas Caucasians often go up to 80 or 100 milligrams oral Winstrol per day even though the body weight might be quite comparable. Maybe the Caucasians are a little bit heavier because, well, we generally have a bigger bone structure compared to the Asians, but that's just generally speaking. In most cases, for similar body weight levels, we would need to dose the oral winstrol higher, making it not worth it, probably preferred to go with the injectable administration route compared to people coming from this part of the world. Regardless of its user, the skin thinning effects are observed within 6 weeks, assuming that the dose is high enough. Now again, in Asians, people of this part of the world, the dose might be 30 to 50 milligrams orally per day, spaced out over several servings. And with Caucasians or people of African descent, that might be higher, maybe 80 to 100 milligrams per day, in which case it's probably better to cut down the dose in half and go with 50 milligrams injectable winstrol suspension instead. 6 weeks is all it takes. The last 6 weeks of your cutting phase or contest prep, subjecting yourself to oral or injectable winstrol for all of these benefits and look phenomenally freaky because, man, the skin thinning effects are so pronounced, especially if you combine that with a cream containing clostrol acetate. I'll link that video at the end of this one, which is also supposedly skin thinning. You get such paper thin skin that you have micro veins everywhere. And really, guys, I'm not joking. The term dick skin was inspired by winstrol use for at least 6 weeks. And well, some guys push it a little bit longer up until 12 weeks. But again, the skin thinning effects are observed in most cases to its maximal potential, assuming that you're already single-digit body fat levels. And if your skin is not thin yet by the 6-week mark, you're still fat, dude. And you need to diet longer. You should abstain from the winstrol because the longer you take it, the more it will compromise your connective tissue health. So again, I would limit the exposure to maybe 8 weeks in duration at higher dosages. And you should only take winstrol when you're already sufficiently lean, uniformly lean, so you can rely on the skin thinning effects, not think that winstrol is some sort of magical fat burner that is going to strip pounds of fat off you. You should already be shredded, and then you add in the winstrol, and then you look like a giant walking cock with veins everywhere that's fully erect. All right, I'll leave it there. We're now getting way off topic. Again, dosages can range from 20 milligrams, 30 milligrams, 50 milligrams, up to 100 milligrams oral winstrol per day, only during contest prep or a cutting phase when you're single digit. And please don't do an oral winstrol only cycle or an oral Anavar only cycle or an oral Turinabol only cycle. Well, you can do an oral Proviron only cycle, but only if you dose it very, very little, 6.25 milligrams once or twice per day. But in the case of Turinabol, Oxandrolone, or Stanozolol, you still need that sweet testosterone base. Anywhere upwards of a TRT dose is acceptable, so at least you can rely on some physiological amount of testosterone and estradiol while you're adding these oral 17-alpha-alkylated anabolic androgenic steroids. On top, for this episode, I'll leave it here. This video is probably like 40 minutes or something, but I think it was insightful. Let me know if it was insightful. Let me know which one of these 4 is your favorite oral steroids. In the next Worth It or Not, I'm going to focus on a couple other, a little bit more exciting and a little bit niche oral steroids, the Superdrols and the halotestins. You know, maybe you'll throw in some check drops, the super heart and super liver toxic compounds that you can choose from, hopefully with limited exposure. Stay tuned for that one. Subscribe now if you're not subscribed already, and hit that freaking notification bell button so you can get notified when the new video drops. Until now, we're out of time. You can find everything that I'm associated with down below in the description section. Have a look at some of my sponsors and affiliates. Use those discount codes and you can save yourself some money while shopping online. Have a look at my Vigorous Steve male lab panel over at Merrick Health. Link down below. You can use code Vigorous for 10% off. And if you don't want to test all of these markers to stay on top of your health, you can just comprise your own male lab panel by choosing the markers you're interested in, and you'll still get 10% discount with the Vigorous codes at checkout. Vigorous crew, you guys know what to do. A front double bicep for you guys. Guess which oral anabolic androgenic steroid I'm going to add in next week after I do my blood work. That's right, it's Anavar. Steve out.